6 people were murdered on a quiet farm in Germany. Their bodies were stacked in a barn. The killer stayed in the house for days, feeding the dog, lighting the fire, and sleeping in the attic. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him leave. And to this day, no one knows who he was. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck Murders, a case that defies logic, resists closure, and still haunts Germany over a century later. Hinterkaifeck wasn't a village. It was barely a dot on the map, tucked between Grobern and Kaifeck, a remote farmstead surrounded by forest, silence, and suspicion. The farm belonged to Andreas Gruber. Stern, suspicious, difficult. He was 63 years old, with a thick beard and a temper that made neighbors keep their distance. His wife, Cecilia, was 72. Quiet, reserved, cold. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, had returned after her husband died in the war. She was 35, a widow. She lived with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Victoria was different, warm, musical, active in the church choir. But her life on the farm was far from peaceful. Rumors swirled that Andreas and Victoria had an unnatural relationship, that Joseph was not her late husband's child, but her father's, that the family was cursed. The farm was large, 2 stories, a barn, a tool shed, a stable, no phone, no electricity, no neighbors nearby. They sold eggs and milk. They kept to themselves. And then, in late March of 1922, they hired a new maid. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She arrived on March 31st. She was dead by morning. The days leading up to the murders were strange, not dramatic, just off. The kind of unease that settles in slowly, like fog creeping through the trees. It began with footprints. On March 25th, Andreas noticed tracks in the snow, leading from the forest to the farm, but none leading back. He followed them to the barn. Nothing was missing. No signs of entry, but the prints were real, deep, fresh. Then came the noises. Footsteps in the attic, heavy, slow. They searched, found nothing, locked the doors. Still, the sounds returned. Andreas found a newspaper no one recognized. Not from town, not from the region. No one knew how it got there. The dog barked at empty corners. The cattle grew restless. Victoria told a friend she felt watched, even inside her own room. Then, on March 30th, the maid quit. Her name was Crescens Rieger. She packed her bags and left without warning. When asked why, she said, "The house is cursed. I hear voices. I won't stay another night." The next day, the Grubers hired Maria Baumgartner. She arrived on March 31st. She was murdered within hours. It happened sometime between the night of March 31st and the early hours of April 1st, 1922. There were no screams, no lights, no signs of struggle. But by morning, 6 people were dead. The killer didn't rush. He moved through the farm with chilling precision, one victim at a time. It began in the barn. Andreas Gruber likely stepped out first, maybe to check on the animals, maybe to investigate a sound in the dark. He never came back. He was struck with a mattock, a heavy farming tool. The blows crushed his skull and tore his face beyond recognition. Then came his wife, Cecilia. She followed him out and died the same way. Victoria was next, dragged into the barn and beaten. Her daughter, little Cecilia, was found nearby, but her death was different. She had clumps of her own hair in her hands, pulled out in terror. She survived the initial attack and died hours later. Inside the house, Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, was in her room. She had just arrived that day. She was unpacking when the killer entered. One blow. She died instantly. The last was Joseph, 2 years old. asleep in his crib. The killer stood over him and ended his life with the same weapon. 6 lives, 1 night. But the horror didn't end there. The bodies in the barn were stacked and covered with hay. The killer had taken time. He had arranged them. And then, he stayed. Neighbors saw smoke from the chimney. Food was missing from the pantry. The dog had been fed. The cattle tended. Someone lived in the house. After the murders, 4 days passed. No one from the Gruber household was seen in town. The children missed school. The farm sat quiet. Too quiet. Neighbors grew uneasy. The dog barked, then went silent. 3 men decided to investigate. One of them was Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a former suitor of Victoria. Some said he was Joseph's real father. Others said he was bitter, rejected, and angry. They approached the farm cautiously. The front door was locked, the windows shuttered. But the barn was open. Inside, the air was heavy, the hay disturbed, and beneath it, the bodies. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia, stacked, covered, rotting. Inside the house, Maria was found in her room, her suitcase still half unpacked, her shoes neatly placed by the bed. In the nursery, Joseph lay in his crib, still, silent, lifeless. No note, no message, no sign of escape. But someone had stayed. The fireplace had been used. Food had been eaten. The dog had been cared for. No footprints led away from the farm. No wagon tracks. No trail. Just silence. And 6 bodies. By the time investigators arrived, the crime scene had already been compromised. Neighbors had wandered through the house, touched the bodies, moved furniture, even fed the animals. What should have been preserved was now contaminated, but the detectives from Munich did what they could. They photographed everything, measured blood splatter, cataloged every item in the home. The murder weapon, a mattock, was never found, but the wounds matched its shape perfectly. Deep gashes, crushed bone, blunt trauma delivered with chilling precision. They searched the attic, where dust patterns revealed someone had been living. Straw bedding, food wrappers, footprints. No fingerprints, no personal items, no sign of who it was. The dog had survived, tied up in the barn, hungry but unharmed. Some believed the killer had spared him. Others thought he'd used the dog to keep the cattle calm. Investigators interviewed dozens of people, neighbors, church members, former employees, and everyone had theories, but no one had answers. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was questioned repeatedly. He had history with Victoria, had once claimed to be Joseph's father, had fought with Andreas over money and land. And when he entered the barn, he seemed too calm, unlocking doors no one else could, touching the bodies without hesitation. But there was no evidence, no confession, no motive that could be proven. Others blamed vagrants, escaped prisoners, a traveling killer who passed through the woods and vanished. But Hinterkaifeck was remote. No roads led in, no tracks led out. The killer had come from the forest and returned to it. The case went cold, and the silence returned. Everyone was a suspect, and no one was charged. Lorenz Schlittenbauer had motive. He knew the farm, had access, had personal ties to the victims, but nothing stuck. Then there was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, officially declared dead in World War I, though his body was never recovered. Some believed he had survived, returned home, discovered Joseph wasn't his child, and snapped. But there were no sightings, no letters, no trace. Another theory pointed to a drifter, someone who had camped in the attic, watched the family, waited for the right moment. But the house was isolated, the terrain unforgiving, and no one saw anyone come or go. Some whispered about incest, a family conspiracy, a murder-suicide gone wrong. But that didn't explain the maid, or the methodical nature of the killings, or the fact that someone had stayed in the house afterward. In 1996, the case was reopened. Modern forensics were applied, DNA tested, old files re-examined. Still, no answers. The killer had vanished, like smoke, like footsteps in the snow. The Hinterkaifeck farm was never rebuilt. After the investigation stalled, the house stood empty for years, a monument to dread, silence, and unanswered questions. Locals avoided it. Children dared each other to approach it, and some claimed they saw lights flickering in the attic, heard footsteps in the barn, felt watched from the trees. Eventually, the farm was demolished, the land cleared, but the story remained. In the decades that followed, the case became legend. Germany's most disturbing unsolved murder, a tale told in whispers, in classrooms, in late-night broadcasts. Books were written, documentaries filmed, podcasts dissected every theory, but no one ever solved it. The Gruber family was buried in a shared grave. No headstone, no epitaph, just names carved into cold stone. The town of Grobern moved on, but Hinterkaifeck became a symbol of isolation, of madness, of evil that wears no face. To this day, the case remains open, not officially, but in the minds of those who still ask, who lived in the attic, who fed the dog, who stayed in a house after the murders. Some believe it was a drifter, others say it was someone close. But the truth may be simpler and darker, that the killer was never a stranger, that he knew the family, knew their routines, knew their secrets, and that he didn't just kill them, he erased them. So what really happened at Hinterkaifeck? Was it a jealous lover, a vengeful neighbor, a drifter who vanished into the woods, or someone closer, someone who knew the family's secrets, their routines, their fears? The footprints led in, but never out. The killer stayed, fed the animals, slept in the attic, lit the fire as if nothing had happened, and then disappeared. No fingerprints, no confession, no closure, just silence. And 6 graves. Let me know your theory in the comments. And if you ever find yourself in a quiet farmhouse deep in the woods, listen closely. The attic might not be empty,